You are listening to Robert Vane's Hegel Podcast.
All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going all the way to the top, to the summit of Hegel's philosophy.
Ah, yes. Absolute spirit.
Exactly, specifically how he lays it out in section 553 of the Encyclopedia.
Yeah, that's definitely a concept that feels very much like reaching the peak of a very high mountain.
You could say that again.
And anyone who has spent time with Hegel knows you can't just magically appear on the summit and immediately grasp the view, right? You have to actually make the climb and see how everything builds on each stage to get there.
Absolutely.
So that's exactly what we're going to do today, right? We're going to trace that path upward. We're going to see how all those steps, the subjective spirit, the objective spirit, all of those things lead us up to absolute spirit.
So think of this as your guided climb.
That's a good way to think about it.
We're going to get you to the top, but we are going to show you every single step along the way. We're going to illuminate all those little aha moments along the way as spirit's journey unfolds. And hopefully by the end of our conversation, you, the listener, will have a much clearer understanding of this often very daunting but incredibly rewarding philosophical territory.
And like any good climb, we got to start at base camp.
Okay, so where's base camp? What are we starting with?
The fundamental building blocks. Hegel's concept of thought itself. From there, we will follow spirit's inward journey in subjective spirit, then its outward expression in objective spirit. And finally, we will get to absolute spirit and all of its fascinating forms of self-recognition.
Okay, so let's set off from base camp then, with Hegel's pretty revolutionary idea about thought. He doesn't see thought as just one of our many mental faculties, does he?
No, not at all.
It's much deeper than that.
Much deeper. Hegel, as he articulates in the Encyclopedia, sees thought not just as a tool we use, but as the very substance that underlies both the external world and the realm of the spirit. So it's not just what we do, it's actually, in a very real sense, what reality is I.
Whoa, okay.
This is really different from a lot of other philosophical traditions that see the mind and the world as these very separate things. Hegel is suggesting they're actually interwoven with thought as this unifying fabric.
Okay, that's a pretty huge perspective shift.
It is.
So can you maybe give us some examples of how this thought as universal substance, how that actually plays out in our own experiences?
Absolutely. Let's think about something as basic as perception. When you look at a tree, it's not just that you are passively receiving that sensory data.
Right.
Your mind is actively involved in recognizing that that is, in fact, a tree.
Yeah.
You're categorizing it based on prior knowledge and on your understanding of things. So that act of recognition is a form of thought at work.
I never thought of it that way.
And it's not just perception. When you form a concept of something like justice, or when you recall a memory, or when you make a decision, or even when you have a simple wish, all of these are manifestations of thought, as one of our sources puts it. In all human perception, thought is present. So too, thought is the universal in all the acts of conception and recollection, in short, in every mental activity, in willing, wishing, and the like.
Okay, so that makes sense. But if thought is this sort of foundational substance, what kind of thinking are we talking about here? Is it just our everyday, run-of-the-mill finite thoughts?
Well, that's where Hegel makes a really important distinction between what he calls finite or discursive thinking and infinite or rational thinking.
Okay, explain that a little bit more for me.
So our everyday thoughts, the finite ones, they operate within these limited categories in opposition.
Like this or that.
Exactly. But truth, according to Hegel, is infinite and interconnected. It can't be completely grasped by these rigid, finite frameworks. True thought strives to overcome these limitations and to really understand the underlying unity and infinity of reality.
So it's like trying to, fit the entire ocean into a teacup.
Exactly. You're never going to capture the vastness of it.
You're not.
And that's really the nature of rational thought. It wants to understand that ocean, the totality of it.
I see. Okay. So how does this infinite thought connect to our sense of self? Our sense of I or ego.
So this is where things get really interesting, I think. Hegel argues that this capacity for infinite thought is very much linked with the I or the ego.
Okay.
And the I for Hegel is this pure act of self-relation, the mind actually reflecting on itself.
That's deep.
It is. He describes it, and this is a little paradoxical, as a kind of vacuum that simultaneously contains a whole universe of concepts.
So even though it's empty, it's full.
In a way, yes. You see, when we say I, even though we're talking about ourselves as this unique individual, we're also expressing a form of universality. We're talking about this capacity for self-consciousness that all human beings have. Every I is aware of its own existence as an I, as a center of thought and experience.
It's universal I.
Exactly. And that self-awareness is a defining characteristic of human consciousness for Hegel.
Got it. Okay, so we've got this foundation of thought as a universal substance.
Right.
It finds its individual expression in this I.
Yes.
So how does spirit, this dynamic force we've been talking about, actually begin its journey of development from this starting point?
You are listening to Robert Vane's Hegel Podcast.
So the first stage is what Hegel calls subjective spirit.
Okay.
And this is the process by which individual consciousness develops its capabilities and how it understands the world. It's an inward journey, really. It starts with the most basic forms of awareness, and then it moves towards more complex cognitive functions. We start with the emergence of intelligence and the ability to form representations of the world in our minds.
Okay, I'm following. Within this realm of representation, Hegel pays a lot of attention to imagination, what he calls Einbildungskraft. I love that word.
You too.
But it's not just about, daydreaming or making things up, right?
No, Hegel is not talking about fairy tales here. He really digs deep into imagination, distinguishing between what he calls reproductive and productive imagination.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So reproductive imagination is more of what we traditionally think of as imagination. It's the ability for us to recall mental images of things that we've experienced.
So like remembering a place we've been.
Exactly, or a melody.
Okay, got it.
But productive imagination, that's a much more active and transformative process.
Okay.
It involves moving beyond the purely sensory, the purely concrete image, and through that negation, the mind can actually grasp the universal within the particular. This leads to what Hegel calls concrete subjectivity.
So what does concrete subjectivity mean?
It's a crucial point where our inner world of understanding and the external world, they actually become intertwined. As our source puts it, productive imagination fantasy is the center in which the universal and being, one's own and what is picked up, internal and external, are completely welded into one. It's like the mind synthesizing and creating meaning from everything it takes in.
It's like we're not just passively absorbing information, we're actually shaping how we understand it.
Exactly.
Okay, so what comes after imagination in this journey of subjective spirit?
So then we get to memory. And for Hegel, memory is much more than just storage. It's really about intelligence, taking full possession of its representations, especially through names.
Names.
Yeah, think about it. When you remember someone's name, you're recognizing them in that name, even without needing a direct sensory experience.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. And Hegel actually distinguishes between reproductive memory, which is recalling specific events or images, and mechanical memory, which is more like rote learning.
So memorizing multiplication tables.
Exactly. Or dates in history. Just pure association.
I see. Okay, so we've got this inward cultivation of consciousness through subjective spirit.
Yes.
Where does spirit go next?
Well, the next movement is outwards into the shared world.
Okay.
It's the realm of objective spirit.
Objective spirit.
Yeah, and this is where individual consciousnesses interact with each other, and they create and are shaped by social institutions, legal frameworks, all of those structures.
So it's like the sphere of how we live together.
Exactly. It's about intersubjectivity and how freedom is realized in a community.
I see. And this is where we run into concepts like right and morality, right?
Yes, exactly. For Hegel, right is the embodiment of those abstract principles of freedom that are found in laws and the formal structures of society. So it's about the universal rights and obligations that apply to everyone.
Okay.
Morality, on the other hand, is more internal and subjective. It's about our conscience, our intentions, our sense of duty.
Okay.
But Hegel sees both right and morality as important, but as incomplete stages in the full realization of freedom.
So they're like stepping stones.
Exactly, towards a more complete expression of spirit. And that more complete expression is what he calls Sittlichkeit. It's often translated as ethical life.
Sittlichkeit.
Yeah. And this is where individual freedom is fully realized within customs, the values, the institutions of a community. It's where individuals identify with the community and find their fulfillment through participating in its life.
I see. So would something like the ancient Greek polis be an example?
That's a perfect example. Hegel looked to the polis as this kind of model of unity where individual good was inseparable from the good of the city, as one source says, because the realization of the idea requires that man be part of a larger life in a society. Moral life reaches its highest realization in Sittlichkeit.
I see. And the state, it plays a really crucial role in this ethical life, doesn't it?
Absolutely. For Hegel, the state is way more than just a collection of individuals or a system for keeping things in order. He calls it the universal, self-originated, and self-developed, the reasonable spirit of will.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
It is, but what he means is that the state is the embodiment of objective reason in the world. It's the framework that guarantees individual rights. A&D guides everyone towards the common good.
It's just like this concrete manifestation of this ethical life we were talking about.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've gone on this incredible journey through subjective spirit, objective spirit, and now we finally reached that summit we were talking about.
You're listening to Robert Vane's Hegel podcast.
Absolute spirit, the peak.
What exactly is this ultimate stage all about?
Well, absolute spirit is the highest stage in Hegel's system. Spirit has already manifested in the world, in human consciousness, and now it turns to reflect on its own unfolding, on its own creations. It's like becoming self-aware, but on a grand universal scale. And Hegel identifies 3 ways that absolute spirit expresses and understands itself: art, religion, and philosophy.
Okay, so let's break those down one by one, starting with art. How does art function as this mode of self-understanding for absolute spirit?
Hegel argues that art tells the truth by presenting what he calls particular universality in a concrete form. It takes universal themes, ideas, human experiences, and puts them into tangible works that we can experience with our senses. Paintings, sculptures, music, poems, all of that.
Okay, that makes sense. But one of our sources points out that poetry, and Hegel loves poetry, can communicate both too little and too much. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a really important point. Poetry can tell too little because its universal truth is always shown through specific characters, stories, images.
So the idea isn't explicitly stated.
Right. It's sort of hidden within the specifics.
Okay.
And it can tell too much because any specific work will always include details, plot points, character traits that aren't really essential to the truth being conveyed. Those things can sometimes distract from the main message.
And Hegel's a huge fan of Greek tragedy, right? Especially Sophocles' Antigone.
Well, absolutely. Antigone was like the pinnacle of art for him.
So where does that fit in?
Well, Hegel saw Antigone as the ultimate example of tragic conflict that arises not from some simple battle of good versus evil, but from a clash of equally valid ethical claims.
Antigone has to bury her brother.
Right, that's her duty to her family. But it goes against Creon's decree as the ruler. Both of them are acting on real principles, but they clash and it leads to tragedy. For Hegel, this reveals a deep truth about those inherent contradictions within ethical life itself.
Right. So what about other art forms? How do things like sculpture, painting, and music compare to poetry in their ability to express this particular universality?
Well, Hegel acknowledged the strengths of each art form, but he saw a kind of progression in their ability to express the inner life of spirit. So for him, sculpture is great at embodying ideal forms, but in a static, material way. Painting, because it creates that illusion of depth on a flat surface, gets a bit closer to expressing inner feelings. Music, because it's temporal and directly expresses emotion, goes even deeper. But poetry, because of its connection to language and thought, has the greatest capacity to articulate universal ideas, even if it's through those particular representations.
So the romantic arts, like music and poetry, are better at expressing that complexity.
Exactly. More so than the classical forms like sculpture.
Okay, so art is one way that absolute spirit reflects on itself.
Right.
What about religion? How does that fit in?
So religion, according to Hegel, uses symbolic telling. It expresses those spiritual truths through stories, rituals, myths, symbolic representations. It makes a distinction between the particular form of the symbol, like an image or a story, and the universal meaning that it represents.
So like parables in the Bible.
Exactly. They use a specific story to illustrate a bigger moral or spiritual point.
But just like with art, it seems like these religious symbols also have limitations.
Oh, absolutely. Symbols are what he calls non-arbitrary signs. There's a connection between the symbol and what it stands for. But any symbol will also have characteristics that aren't relevant to the universal meaning. So they can say too little because their concrete form can't fully capture the abstract truth.
You need many symbols to get the whole picture.
Exactly. And they can say too much by including irrelevant details.
Like representing God in human terms.
Exactly. It's always going to be limited.
You're listening to Robert Vane's Hegel podcast.
Now, one of our sources mentions 3 moments within what Hegel calls the consummate religion. that mirror his whole philosophical system. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, that's a really cool connection. So Hegel saw Christianity as the consummate religion because he felt its doctrines really embodied the movement of spirit.
Okay.
And he saw three moments within Christianity that matched up with the three main parts of his encyclopedia: the logic, the philosophy of nature, and the philosophy of spirit.
Whoa, that's some symmetry.
It is. So the first moment, God as the Father, represents pure universality. That's like the abstract concepts in the logic.
Okay.
Then God as the Son, the incarnation, represents particularity, actually existing in the world.
Like the philosophy of nature.
Exactly. And finally, God as the Holy Spirit represents the unity of the universal and particular, God being present in the community.
So that's like the philosophy of spirit.
Exactly. It's spirit becoming aware of its own unity.
Wow. Okay, so both art and religion have their limitations in fully capturing the truth.
Oh.
So that brings us to the final form, philosophy. How does that overcome those limitations?
Well, philosophy, for Hegel, is uniquely able to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
That's a tall order.
It is, but he believes philosophy can do it, and it does it through purely linguistic and conceptual forms. It moves beyond the images of art and the symbols of religion and tries to grasp the nature of reality through pure thought and logic.
So it's all about abstract ideas.
Yes. Hegel's philosophical language is very abstract and avoids concrete examples or metaphors, all to achieve a truly objective understanding.
And this is where his idea of the speculative proposition comes in, right?
Yes. You see, traditional logic uses subject-predicate statements, but Hegel felt those create a separation between the thing and its properties.
Like the tree and its greenness.
Exactly. But the speculative proposition tries to overcome that. It wants to express the essential unity within the concept itself.
So the tree isn't just green, it's inherently green.
You got it. And Hegel's language, especially in the logic, is all about self-referential intelligibility.
Okay, explain that one.
So the idea is that the fundamental concepts, he calls them the original words, they only speak of themselves. They ultimately become identical with logos, with pure thought.
So it's a language that's trying to be completely transparent, completely clear.
Exactly.
All right, last but not least, we need to talk about those three syllogisms of the mind that Hegel puts at the very end of the encyclopedia. What do those represent in terms of absolute spirit?
Those syllogisms represent the culmination of absolute spirit's self-knowing process. It's the final movement in the whole encyclopedia. But they're not separate entities. They're interconnected moments in spirit's journey to understand itself, viewed from its highest point. It's like spirit looking back on its whole development and recognizing itself fully.
Okay, so what are those three moments?
The first moment, mind in its immediacy, corresponds to art. Here, the universal content of spirit takes the form of sensory intuition, artistic representation. We experience those truths through art. The second, mind in its reflection, aligns with religion. Now, the universal content is represented through feelings, pictures, symbols. We have to reflect and interpret to grasp the meaning. And finally, mind in its absolute self-knowing is philosophy. This is where we grasp the truth in its pure conceptual form.
Free from those limitations of images and symbols.
Exactly.
So these syllogisms show us how spirit discovers itself. It starts with direct experience in art, then moves to reflective understanding in religion, and finally achieves this full conceptual grasp in philosophy.
Precisely. It's the culmination of spirit understanding its own nature and development.
Wow, what a journey.
It is.
So to wrap things up, we've seen how Hegel builds this incredible system. It starts with thought as the universal substance. Then we go through the development of individual consciousness and subjective spirit, its realization in the social and political structures of objective spirit, and finally we arrive at absolute spirit.
And it recognizes itself in art, religion, and philosophy.
Right, and all of that is summarized in the self-knowing of those three syllogisms.
Exactly. And by understanding this process, you, the listener, gain a really deep insight into Hegel's philosophy.
You really see what it means for spirit to know itself.
Yes.
So our final thought for you is this. How do these three shapes of absolute spirit, art, religion, and philosophy continue to operate in our world today? How do you, as an individual, engage with the truth? Which one of these resonates most with you right now?
That's something for you to ponder. We definitely encourage you to explore Hegel's Encyclopedia, especially section 553 and the sections on subjective and objective spirit, to really appreciate his ideas. Trust me, there's always something new to discover in philosophy.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Until next time.
See you then.